Something happened at the Vatican this week. And for many, it wasn't just surprising, it was sacred. There were no official statements, no press releases, no Vatican bulletins. But anyone watching closely saw it. And anyone who understood the weight of tradition felt it in their bones. Pope Leo XIV did something that hadn't been done in years. Something his predecessor, Pope Francis, had quietly altered during his papacy, a change that, for many, went unnoticed outside the walls of the church, but for others marked a shift so profound it was like watching a familiar landscape rearranged. It was the return of a single tradition, a gesture, a detail, but also a door. And once that door creaked open again, silently, reverently, the light it let in revealed far more than just a liturgical preference. It revealed a papacy that may be charting a different course, not with declarations, but with deliberate sacred actions. Let's step back. Because in order to understand what Pope Leo did, and why it matters, we have to understand what was changed, when it was changed, and why this small restoration might carry weight far beyond a single Massachusetts. The power of a gesture. In Catholic liturgy, nothing is ever truly small. A hand raised, a vestment worn, a word emphasized. Each action is saturated with meaning, layered through centuries, anchored in Scripture, and animated by the Church's long memory. And yet, many of these ancient gestures have slowly disappeared over the past decade. Not with fanfare, not through condemnation, but through quiet omissions, all in the name of pastoral sensitivity, modernization, or local enculturation. Pope Francis was often described as a reformer, not necessarily because of changes to doctrine, but because of his approach to symbols, structure, and emphasis. His leadership style emphasized simplicity, humility, and decentralization, and that included the liturgy. Under his pontificate, certain ceremonial acts traditionally reserved to the Pope were either omitted, abbreviated, or delegated. Some of these decisions were pastoral, others strategic. But for those deeply rooted in the Church's liturgical life, they were not without pain. To these faithful, young and old alike, the gestures meant something. They weren't nostalgic preferences. They were threads that tied the Church of today to the Church of the Saints. And when those threads were cut, something spiritual, not just procedural, was lost. The 2014 decision. Let's look at just one example, the tradition of the apostolic blessing with the triple sign of the cross. For centuries, this solemn blessing, where the Pope raises his hand and traces three distinct crosses over the people, was reserved for extraordinary moments, papal blessings, special feast days, and the conclusion of solemn masses. The gesture wasn't just formal. It was theological. The triple cross signified the Holy Trinity. It evoked apostolic authority. It reminded the Church that her shepherd spoke not in his own name, but in the name of the triune God. In 2014, Pope Francis quietly stopped using the triple sign of the cross in most of his public masses and Urbi et Orbi blessings. He offered blessings, yes, but with a single cross or sometimes only with words. There was no formal suppression, no condemnation of the old practice. Just a gradual phasing out. Over time it faded. And with its fading came questions. Was this a change in emphasis? A nod to simplicity? A shift away from clericalism? For some, it was all of those things, and maybe it was necessary. But for others, something spiritual felt missing. Something ancient and powerful had been reduced, quietly placed in the background. That's why what Pope Leo did this week matters. Because during a major Mass in St. Peter's Basilica, as the world watched, Pope Leo lifted his hand at the end of the liturgy, and traced the triple sign of the cross over the faithful. Deliberately. Solemnly. Without explanation. And in that one moment, tradition re-entered the room. No decree, just devotion. There was no announcement. No new instruction. No declaration that this gesture is now restored. Instead, it happened the way sacred things often do, gently, subtly, like a whisper that carries farther than a shout. The cameras caught it. The faithful noticed. And those who had long held that tradition in their hearts, those who remembered seeing it in their youth, or who had only read about it in old missals, felt it immediately. It wasn't just about what was done. It was about who did it. This was the successor of Peter. In the heart of the Vatican. Surrounded by the saints. Reaching back to something the Church had once loved, and offering it again, not with fanfare, but with faith. It wasn't just a ritual. It was a message. What did it mean? Now skeptics might say, it's just a blessing. Why does it matter so much? And on the surface, maybe it doesn't. But within the Church, especially for those who love her deeply, gestures matter. Because gestures carry theology. And theology, when lived, becomes witness. When Pope Leo restored the triple blessing, he wasn't making a political statement. He wasn't challenging Pope Francis directly. He didn't say a word. But he did open a conversation. What is the role of tradition in our time? Is the past something to be protected, or simply referenced? Can reverence coexist with renewal? And most of all, do the gestures of the Church still carry meaning in a world that's forgetting how to see them? For many Catholics, the answer is yes. And Pope Leo just reminded them that the Church hasn't forgotten either. A Pope of signs, not slogans. From the beginning of his papacy, Pope Leo XIV has preferred depth over drama. He does not tweet. He does not chase headlines. He speaks softly, preaches earnestly, and prays often. But he has also shown a clear pattern. When something needs saying, he often says it without words. In his first month as Pope, he quietly returned to the tradition of wearing the red papal shoes. A custom long associated with martyrdom and service. He brought back the full-length Mozzetta cape. He resumed kneeling during the consecration at every Mass, even when aides urged him not to, citing his knee pain. And now this. The triple blessing. A gesture no one demanded, but many had longed for. If anything, Pope Leo is slowly emerging as a pope who restores, not by debate, but by devotion. The restoration is not a rebellion. It's important to be clear. This is not a war of popes. This is not about Pope Francis versus Pope Leo XIV. The Church is not divided into camps of loyalty or opposition. It is one body, though sometimes it limps. But the faithful are watching. And for many of them, this moment is not about sides. It's about signals. It's about being seen. About being reminded that what was once holy is still holy. That reverence has not been retired. That the Church remembers. And that she still knows how to speak through silence. There's another layer here. One that is harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Pope Leo's restoration of traditional gestures is resonating not with the elderly, but with the young. It's the seminarians, the young priests, the newly married couples, the converts, and the teenagers kneeling at adoration who are noticing. They're the ones reposting the moment. They're the ones tearing up watching the clip on their phones. They're the ones saying, I thought this was gone forever. I've never seen a pope do that before. It feels like the Church I fell in love with. This is not nostalgia. These are not relics. These are roots. And Pope Leo, in his quiet way, is watering them. And still, it was just a moment. It's important to be cautious. One gesture is not a revolution. One blessing is not a manifesto. One Mass does not erase a decade. There are still many unanswered questions. Traditionis Custodes, the controversial document that restricted the Latin Mass, is still in force. Bishops are still divided. The faithful who prefer the old rite still live in a precarious tension with local diocesan leadership. And Pope Leo has not yet addressed these issues head-on. So what now? When Pope Leo XIV raised his hand and traced the triple sign of the cross over the faithful, restoring a long-absent tradition once removed under Pope Francis, he did not just perform a rite. He invoked a language older than words. This was a moment saturated with spiritual and historical significance. Because in the Church, a gesture is never just a gesture. It is a message, a theology, a flame passed hand to hand through centuries. To understand why this one act matters so much to so many, we must descend deeper into the soul of liturgy, the rhythms of Rome, and the quiet power of restoration. For the modern mind, gestures are often dismissed as ornamental, non-essential, background noise to the real message. But in Catholic worship, gestures are everything. They are the body language of heaven. A priest lifting the host. A penitent making the sign of the cross. A bishop kneeling. These actions preach, even when no words are spoken. The triple sign of the cross, once used routinely by popes at the end of solemn blessings, and papal liturgies, carried a deep spiritual structure. Each cross traced in the air invoked one person of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. 3 signs. 3 movements. 1 God. The Pope, acting as the Vicar of Christ, extended this ancient blessing to the world, not as a personal favor, but as a channel of divine grace. And when Pope Francis simplified that act, favoring a single sign or merely a spoken blessing, it was not heresy. It was not rebellion. But it was different. Something was lost. And for many, something was grieved. Simplicity is beautiful. But when simplicity forgets symbolism, it begins to flatten mystery. Under Pope Francis, the drive toward a more pastoral and approachable church led to a stripping away of many traditional forms. Genuflections became optional. Latin hymns became rare. Incense was used sparingly. And traditional vestments began collecting dust. The triple sign of the cross was just one piece of a larger mosaic being rearranged. To Francis, this shift was meant to bring the Church closer to the people. And in many ways, it did. His warmth and informality endeared him to millions. But as the Church grew closer, some felt she also became blurrier. The rich visual language that once lifted hearts toward transcendence was traded, some would say diluted, for casual accessibility. What was once majestic began to feel managerial. And for those who loved the Church's mystery, this was not progress. It was disorientation. That's why Pope Leo's gesture felt so shocking, and so healing. Because in just a few seconds he reminded the world that the sacred still has a place. That mystery still matters. That the Pope is not only a pastor, he is also a priest. There's a saying among Vatican insiders: Rome never forgets. And while popes may come and go, the institutional memory of the Church runs deep. Liturgical scholars, curial officials, and traditional communities all remember what once was. Not because they are stuck in the past, but because the past helps them understand the present. So when Pope Leo raised his hand with 3 deliberate crosses, these observers took note. Not in anger, not in resistance, but in reverence. He was speaking in their language. He was opening a dialogue with the dead, with the saints who once stood in those very shoes, and with the living, who still long to be rooted in something that doesn't shift with the times. And the message was clear: Rome remembers you. Rome remembers this. Rome remembers her roots. This is not the first time a pope has changed the course of history with a gesture. In 1978, when Pope John Paul II kissed the ground of his homeland upon arriving in Poland, it was more than a greeting. It was a silent declaration that shook the foundations of communist power. That kiss lit a spiritual fire that helped spark the Solidarity movement, and eventually brought down the Iron Curtain. In 2005, Pope Benedict XVI chose to wear the red papal shoes again, a tradition abandoned by John Paul II. Many mocked the fashion choice, but liturgists saw the deeper meaning. The red shoes symbolized the blood of the martyrs and the Pope's willingness to walk in their footsteps. And now, in 2025, Pope Leo XIV has lifted his hand and crossed it thrice. Not because it's trendy, not because it's nostalgic, but because it says something enduring. The papacy is not a personality. It is a lineage, a tradition, a calling. If Pope Francis emphasized encounter, Pope Leo XIV seems to be emphasizing reverence. And reverence is not opposed to encounter. But it does demand one thing: attention. To be reverent is to stop scrolling, to listen, to notice what is holy, even when it's subtle. Pope Leo's gesture is precisely that, subtle. But it demands attention. Not to himself, not to controversy, but to the mystery of God that the liturgy seeks to reveal. The Catholic Mass is not a performance. It's not a lecture. It's not even primarily a teaching moment. It is an encounter with the living God. Every word, every silence, every gesture is meant to draw the faithful into that encounter. When tradition is preserved, that encounter becomes more vivid, more embodied, more timeless. And when tradition is disrupted, even for good pastoral reasons, the encounter risks becoming casual, forgettable, or even confusing. That's why this moment matters. Because Pope Leo didn't just restore a tradition, he restored a clarity. He reminded us that the Mass is not ours to edit endlessly. It is a sacred inheritance, received, not invented. Vatican response: silence. So far. Unsurprisingly, the Vatican has issued no official comment on Pope Leo's gesture. No document. No press briefing. No explanation. And in a way, that's part of the power. Because when something holy is reintroduced, it doesn't always need words. The silence of the Vatican may be strategic, but it also allows the gesture to speak for itself. And that's exactly what it's doing, in parishes, in seminaries, in coffee shops, and in private prayer rooms around the world. Catholics are talking, not just about the triple blessing, but about what it represents. The people are watching. Across continents, ordinary Catholics have begun asking quietly, is something changing? They notice more than we think. They notice which saints are quoted, which vestments are worn, which traditions are cherished, and which are sidelined. And when a pope makes a move toward tradition, the faithful who love the old ways feel seen, not as obstacles, not as troublemakers, but as sons and daughters of the Church, longing to kneel before something sacred. Pope Leo's gesture didn't solve everything, but it acknowledged something powerful. That beauty, when rooted in tradition, evangelizes. That the world doesn't need less reverence, it needs more. That what was once loved by saints need not be feared by moderns. Could this be the beginning of something greater? This question lingers in every hallway of the Vatican right now. Is Pope Leo planning a broader restoration? Some insiders believe so. Others are unsure. There have been whispers of a working group quietly reviewing aspects of Traditionis Custodes, the 2021 document by Pope Francis that restricted the celebration of the traditional Latin Massachusetts. There are also rumors of new appointments coming, bishops and cardinals more open to liturgical richness and theological depth. And some say this small gesture was the first public hint the soft launch of a deeper vision. But no one knows for sure. Because Pope Leo does not govern through declarations. He governs through signs. And signs, as Scripture teaches, are meant to be discerned, not dictated. In the Church, memory is not just recollection. It is identity. When a pope reintroduces a sacred gesture, he is not dragging the Church backward. He is anchoring her. Because without memory, the Church becomes reactive, shapeless, disconnected from her soul. Tradition, rightly understood, is not resistance to the new. It is fidelity to the true. And Pope Leo's triple blessing wasn't a longing for the past. It was a reassertion of something deeper, that the sacred is never outdated. And when forgotten, it waits. And when remembered, even by one hand raised in silence, it comes alive again. There is a moment in every story where time seems to pause. When silence becomes more powerful than noise. When one small act lingers in the air long after it's over, because it hints at something deeper. That's the moment we're in now. Pope Leo XIV's restoration of the triple sign of the cross was that moment. One brief gesture. But it landed like a question in the heart of the Church. What now? Will this be remembered as a symbolic act, beautiful but isolated? Or will it mark the beginning of something greater, something that reaches deep into the spiritual bloodstream of the Church? Because if tradition is being gently reawakened, even subtly, then the next steps will matter more than the gesture itself. Traditional Catholics, watching and waiting. The communities most affected by liturgical change in the past decade are not making noise. Right now. They are not storming Twitter. They are not issuing manifestos. They are doing what they've always done, praying. But make no mistake, they are paying attention. These are the Catholics who attend the traditional Latin Massachusetts, who teach their children Gregorian chant, who kneel at communion and whisper prayers older than their grandparents, who remember a time when incense filled every Easter vigil and the Eucharist was veiled in silence and awe. And for years they have felt like exiles in their own church. Not by choice, but by circumstance. When Pope Francis issued Traditionis Custodes in 2021, restricting the celebration of the pre-Vatican II liturgy, it was a blow, not just administratively, but spiritually. Many traditional communities lost their places of worship. Some were forced to relocate. Others were told their form of prayer was no longer needed, no longer wanted. They obeyed. But they wept. And now, with one papal gesture, something has stirred. Hope. Not triumph. Not arrogance. Just quiet, cautious hope. Because Pope Leo did not give them a document. But he gave them something maybe even more powerful. He gave them a sign. A new approach to unity? One of the stated goals of Pope Francis's reforms was unity through simplification. A church with fewer internal divides, less liturgical variation, fewer clashes of vision. But unity built on erasing difference isn't always unity. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's survival. Pope Leo seems to be offering a different vision of unity, one not rooted in uniformity, but in reverence. He's not issuing sweeping reforms. He's not reopening liturgical wars. But what he is doing is listening. And for the first time in years, many Catholics feel heard, not through a press release, but through a blessing. Because real unity begins with acknowledgement. And real healing begins with being seen. Will Traditionis Custodes be revisited? This is the question swirling through seminaries, bishops' offices, and editorial boards around the world. Will Pope Leo reverse Traditionis Custodes? Will he lift the restrictions on the Latin Mass? So far, there's no definitive answer. But several signs are worth noting. In recent months, Pope Leo has met privately with priests and communities attached to the traditional Latin Mass, meetings that were warm, respectful, and deeply pastoral. He appointed an archbishop with strong liturgical roots to a major Roman diocese, known for its traditional parishes. A group of Vatican liturgists were recently seen reviewing documents related to Summorum Pontificum, the 2007 motu proprio by Pope Benedict XVI at once gave wide permission for the Latin Massachusetts. And now, with this gesture, the triple blessing, the momentum seems to be shifting. No announcements. No rollback. But a rebalancing. A whisper of reconsideration. Because for Pope Leo, this may not be about replacing one era with another. It may be about building a bridge between them. Young people and the sacred. There's an irony here that many have missed. In the rush to modernize liturgy and reach the next generation, the Church has often assumed that young people are allergic to tradition. But the opposite is true. Ask any campus chaplain. Ask any seminarian. Ask any 22-year-old convert kneeling before the Eucharist in candlelight. The hunger for the sacred is real, and it is rising. Today's youth do not want entertainment. They want transcendence. They don't want smoke machines. They want incense. They don't want casual conversations. They want encounter. And they are finding it, not in new programs, but in ancient prayers. This is what makes Pope Leo's gesture so potent. He isn't chasing trends. He's recognizing something deeper, that the future of the Church may be younger, more reverent, and more traditional than anyone expected. Internal resistance? Of course, not everyone is celebrating. Some church leaders and theologians worry that any movement back toward pre-Francis practices could fracture the Church further. They fear a resurgence of division, a rise in liturgical tribalism, a reversal of the emphasis on local expression. They argue that Pope Francis's vision was not a rejection of tradition, but a pastoral response to modern needs, and that to shift course now would be to undo a decade of careful work. These voices are not without reason. Change, even change towards something beautiful, can create instability. But perhaps what Pope Leo is offering is not rollback, but reconciliation. Not a rejection of his predecessor, but an integration. A way of saying, we don't have to choose between reverence and relevance. We can live both. What does this mean for the ordinary Catholic? You may be wondering, if I'm not a liturgist, a theologian, or a Vatican watcher, does this really affect me? Yes. Profoundly. Because what happens in Rome always echoes outward. If the center of the Church is rediscovering the sacred, even one gesture at a time, that rediscovery will ripple into every corner of Catholic life. It will shape how children learn the Massachusetts, how priests preach and vest, how families pray, how music is chosen, how churches are built, how silence is respected. It may take years, decades even. But the Church moves like a river, slow, deep, unstoppable. And when the current shifts, even subtly, the direction of the whole body begins to change. A spark, not a fire. Yet, at this stage, everything is still unfolding. Pope Leo has made no speeches. He has issued no directives. But he has lit a match. And in the hearts of millions, that spark has found dry wood. Not because they want revolution, but because they want restoration. Not to go back, but to go deeper. To rediscover the sacred, not as a museum piece, but as a living fire. And that's why the next part of this journey matters. Because the gesture was the beginning. But the response, from bishops, priests, and people, will determine whether it becomes a revival. At first, it was just a gesture. No words. No document. No command. Just a hand raised, and 3 crosses traced in the air. But beneath that quiet movement was something far more powerful. A current. A stirring. A reminder. Something holy had returned, not because it had been forced, but because it had been remembered. And in that memory lies the seed of revival. Because what Pope Leo XIV did was not simply liturgical. It was deeply spiritual. And like all things of the Spirit, its fruit will depend not on policy, but on the hearts that carry it forward. The Church moves slowly, but surely. Across history, the Catholic Church has never been a place of rapid change. She is a ship that turns slowly, deeply anchored in centuries of tradition. Sometimes that frustrates people. Sometimes it saves her from collapse. And yet, every now and then, the Spirit stirs the surface. A new breeze moves across the bow. And something once forgotten rises again, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. That's where we are now. Pope Leo XIV's gesture, the return of the triple blessing, a tradition paused under Pope Francis, was not meant to trigger controversy. It was not a rebellion. It was a reminder. A whisper to the soul of the Church: you are still holy. You are still ancient. You still remember who you are. The role of the laity, not passive, but participating. This moment is not only about the hierarchy. It's not about what Pope Leo will do next. It's about what we, the faithful, will do now. Because the revival of tradition is not simply a Vatican affair. It must begin in homes, in parishes, in hearts. You don't need to wear vestments to reclaim reverence. You don't need Latin to honor sacred memory. You only need desire, a desire to meet God not as a concept, but as mystery. That desire begins with silence. It deepens with devotion. And it flowers through faithfulness. If Pope Leo's gesture spoke to your spirit, then let that moment bear fruit in your daily life. Kneel with more attention. Pray with more awe. Speak of the Church with more love, not just criticism. Return to confession. Light a candle for the Church. Start small. Because every movement of the Spirit begins in secret. The faithful who waited in silence. There is a group of Catholics who deserve to be honored in this moment, though they will never ask for recognition. They are the quiet ones. The ones who saw their beloved form of worship restricted, and obeyed. The ones who heard their love for tradition called rigid, and responded with gentleness. The ones who were pushed to the margins, but never stopped praying. They didn't protest. They persevered. They didn't rage. They remembered. They held their sacred memories like embers in their hearts, not to throw as weapons, but to keep the fire alive until someone returned. And now, someone has. Pope Leo didn't open the doors with a bang. He simply turned the handle. But for those who had been waiting outside, that was everything. Not a return, a renewal. Let's be clear. This is not about going back to 1950. Or undoing Vatican II. Or picking one pope over another. It is not a return. It is a renewal. Because tradition is not a fossil. It is not a costume. It is not a frozen relic to be admired behind glass. Tradition is a living flame. And the role of each generation is not to relight it from scratch, but to keep it burning with reverence. The saints did not preserve the liturgy because they were afraid of change. They preserved it because it was true, because it had formed their hearts, because it carried the fragrance of heaven. And now, once more, that fragrance is being released into the air. One gesture, one spark, one sign. Enough to awaken a longing that never died, only slept. Why sacredness still matters. We live in a distracted age. Noise surrounds us. Screens consume us. Reverence is rare. And yet, the human heart still aches for it. That's why the sacred is not just desirable, it's essential. Because sacredness points us beyond ourselves. It reminds us that we are not the center. That life is not about control. That the liturgy is not ours to manipulate, but God's gift to receive. Pope Leo's gesture recentered the focus. Not on him, Not on politics, not on trends, but on God. It was a priestly act, a fatherly act, a papal act. And it spoke volumes, not by what it said, but by what it refused to ignore. The battle is not political, it's spiritual. Let's not reduce this to a debate about church politics. Yes, there are factions. Yes, there are disagreements. But the real battle is not between left and right. It's between reverence and indifference. Between casual faith and committed discipleship. Between noise and silence. Between self-expression and self-offering. This moment, if we're paying attention, is not calling us to take sides. It's calling us to fall on our knees. Not to argue, but to adore. Not to demand change, but to become the change, by choosing what is holy, beautiful, true. Because that's how revival begins. What the future holds. Only God knows what's next. Pope Leo may issue new guidelines. He may not. He may revisit tradition's custodes. He may take time. But what matters now is not just what comes from Rome. It's what comes from us. Will we make room for the sacred in our lives again? Will we teach our children to kneel? Will we rediscover the power of silence? Will we let our hearts be pierced by beauty? Because the future of the Church will not be built by slogans or surveys. It will be built, as it always has, by saints. And saints are forged in the furnace of faithfulness. A message to the forgotten. To those who have felt cast aside. To those who loved the old ways and were told to let them go. To those who prayed for years with no answer. To those who still carry the memory of the sacred like a scar. This moment is for you. You were not foolish to hope. You were not wrong to love. You were not forgotten. And though no proclamation has yet been made, your fidelity has not gone unnoticed. You are part of the Church's deep-root system. And when the leaves looked withered, you kept the sap flowing underground. Thank you? Because without you, this moment may never have come. An invitation, not a conclusion. This isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of a conversation. Not in boardrooms, but in hearts. And it starts with one question. What will I do with this spark? Will I carry it? Will I hide it? Will I fan it? Will I pass it on? Because revival never begins in the headlines. It begins in the hidden. In the mother who returns to daily rosary. In the seminarian who studies with reverence. In the child who watches Mass with wonder. In the priest who offers the Eucharist with trembling hands. And yes, in the Pope who lifts his hand and remembers. There is a door that has been cracked open again. The light shining through is not the light of one man. It is the light of memory, of reverence, of the sacred. And the question is not whether that light will grow. The question is whether we will step toward it. Because tradition is not a prison. It is a path. It leads not backward but upward. Toward God. Toward all. Toward home. So take this moment seriously. Not as a call to division, but as a call to devotion. To return. To remember. To revive. Because the sacred still speaks. And today, once again, the Church is listening.